Hey there, this is your teacher, Mr. H, and you're watching History in a Hoodie. Today's episode is about the Great Depression, where we'll learn all about how Georgians suffered the worst economic collapse in U.S. history. I can't wait to find out, so let's get this show started. What are we learning about today? The standard for today's lesson asks the students to describe Georgia's contributions to World War I. We will also explain economic factors that resulted in the Great Depression, including the boll weevil and drought. Finally, we will discuss President Roosevelt's ties to Georgia, including his visits to Warm Springs and his impact on the state. Before we start, let's go over some vocabulary for today's lesson. War bonds were government debt issued to pay for military operations during times of war. Victory gardens were a vegetable garden planted at home to increase food production during a war. Black Tuesday was the date that stock prices completely collapsed, the start of the Great Depression. The boll weevil is a small insect that feeds on the fibers of a cotton ball. Credit is receiving goods and services before payment, based on the trust that payment will be made in the future with interest. Hoovervilles were shantytowns built by unemployed people during the Depression. Polio is an infectious disease that can cause temporary or permanent paralysis. World War I, then known as the Great War or the War to End All Wars, lasted from 1914 to 1918, with the U.S. only becoming involved in the last couple years. While the U.S. and our state didn't become involved until the end of the war, the First World War did have some significant effects on our country and state. During the Great War, Georgia's main contribution to the war effort was expanding its military bases. Georgia built or grew to house several major military installations during the war: Fort McPherson, Fort Oglethorpe, Fort Screven, Camp Hancock, the Arsenal at Augusta, Camp Gordon, Camp Benning, and Camp Stewart. McPherson, Gordon, Benning, and Stewart were training camps for soldiers, which helped prepare over 100,000 Georgians to take part in the war. Georgians back home also participated in planting victory gardens to help supply the troops, buying war bonds to help fund the military, and collecting and recycling scrap metal to turn into arms and ammunition for the troops. The next major history event in the U.S. is the Great Depression, which occurred just 5 years after the First World War. Many historians connect these two events because during the World War, the economy was booming due to wartime manufacturing: tanks, guns, airplanes, etc. Once the war ended and military hardware was no longer needed, those factories shut down, the workers lost their jobs, and the economy started its downturn. While the end of World War I is a factor in the economic crash of 1929, it is not the only reason. Most historians point to Black Tuesday, or October 29, 1929, as the start date of the Great Depression, because it is the day the stock market completely crashed. However, Georgia and many other southern states had been feeling the effects of a poor economy for 15 years already. Georgia was still King Cotton territory. That meant that if the cotton crop would fail one year, most of Georgia's population would suffer. And that's exactly what happened in 1915, when the boll weevil arrived in Georgia. The boll weevil is a small insect that eats cotton plants. This tiny insect destroyed so many acres of farmland that many farmers left the South for jobs in factories up north, and eventually it forced the remaining Georgian farmers to diversify their crops. As if the boll weevil wasn't enough of a problem, from 1924 through 1927 and 1930 through 1935, Georgia experienced its worst droughts in state history. The combination of the insect disaster and the natural disaster led to Georgians experiencing the Great Depression long before other corners of our country. Outside of Georgia, the Great Depression was really caused by 4 factors: overproduction of agricultural goods, buying on credit, stock market speculation, and bank failures. Overproduction meant that farmed crops, like cotton, lost their value, and farmers couldn't sell their crops for as much. This bankrupted many smaller farms. Imagine if your parents gave you a credit card and told you it had a spending limit of $3,000 on it. What would you do with it? probably go crazy buying ridiculous stuff you don't need and ignore the fact that you would have to pay it back later. When credit cards were first produced in the early 1900s, that's exactly what a lot of adults did too, as they learned the hard way that they would have to pay everything back with interest. Millions of average people went deep into debt and struggled to get out of it. Because people were buying on credit rapidly, it seemed that many companies were much more successful than normal, so investors spent a lot of their life savings investing in the stock market. After the everyday consumers went broke from their debt and couldn't buy anymore, the stock market shrunk once again, and $40 billion was lost from people's life savings in a very short time. This led to a run on banks as people would try to withdraw all their remaining money. When those banks ran out of money, which they did not keep enough for every person who deposited, the bank failed, and more people lost their life savings since money wasn't insured or protected. This could mean entire communities going broke as their bank lost their money. So what? Why was Georgia's Great Depression experience different than other areas of the country? It wouldn't be until the 1980s when farmers could begin to eradicate the boll weevil, and it wasn't until 2000 that cotton production returned to a profitable state in Georgia once more. Despite Henry Grady's attempts with the New South goal to shift Georgia away from an agricultural economy to an industrial one, Georgia was a cotton state. Cotton failed earlier than the stock markets did, so Georgia failed earlier as well. This was true of many other agricultural states as well. The droughts and boll weevils destroyed crops in the South and Midwest states, creating the Dust Bowl. People lost their jobs and means of gaining wealth. Unemployment in the U.S. arrived at 25%, or 1 in every 4 adults without work. Impoverished people lost their homes and moved into homeless communities, lovingly nicknamed Hoovervilles, after President Herbert Hoover, whose inaction, many people believed, led to the continuing of the Great Depression longer than it needed to be. The Great Depression was an era that impacted the culture of everyday Americans. As a young politician, Franklin Roosevelt spent some time in rural Georgia, where he witnessed firsthand the great poverty that covered the state during the 20s and 30s. Roosevelt came to Georgia much more frequently beginning in 1924 when he was diagnosed with polio, then an incurable disease that caused paralysis. He came to a small town in southwestern Georgia, Warm Springs, because the natural hot springs water was believed to be a potential treatment to his polio condition. He later built his own home in the town, nicknamed the Little White House. During his visits to Georgia, Roosevelt became well connected to the needs of the rural poor. This led him to preparing a presidential run and planning out his New Deal for Americans. Now what? What am I going to do with this information? President Roosevelt was New York elite. He was a cousin to former president, rich, and set for life. The elite, especially political elite, often do not see the problems going on for the poorest class in our country. Herbert Hoover had been president for most of the economic crisis that was the Depression, but he wasn't stirred into action to make significant change to solve the problems of the poor. Roosevelt was different. It may be somewhat coincidental that Roosevelt figured out the problems in Georgia because he stayed in the state while seeking treatment for an unfortunate disease. If he hadn't contracted polio, would he have noticed Georgia's rural poor? Who knows? But even so, he could have behaved just like those political elite and turn up his nose at the impoverished. He could have said that they were someone else's problem, not his. In Michael Jackson's hit song from 1988, Man in the Mirror, the opening verse says, "I see the kids in the streets with not enough to eat. Who am I to be blind, pretending not to see their needs?" You have to respect FDR for seeing a problem and not being blind to it. You have to respect any person who sees a problem and solves it. Maybe that's why FDR is the only president in U.S. history that won a third election to be president, while Hoover lost re-election and is commonly considered one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. Wow, so learning about the Great Depression is really important for us to understand. I'm glad we learned it today. Are you ready for some review questions? What was Georgia's most important contribution to World War I? Why is it sometimes said that rural Georgians never realized that there was a Great Depression that occurred during the late 1920s and 30s? The boll weevil is... The boll weevil came to Georgia in 1915, and a severe drought hit Georgia in 1924. According to the graphs, what impact did these events have on Georgia? Why did Franklin Roosevelt spend so much time in Georgia? I hope all of you learned a lot from today's episode of History in a Hoodie about the Depression era in Georgia. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Just kidding, I don't care about that stuff. But do make sure you study this lesson. Bye now.